right, how we doing, folks? Today is the 30th of July, and this is episode number 3 of WarTrackerTV. I'm your host, Matt. The purpose of WarTrackerTV is to bring awareness to any and all conflicts and wars happening across the globe. We'll learn about different groups of people, countries, governments, religions, and other factors contributing to these events. I am an expert on nothing, and I'm merely here to help facilitate the learning of these topics. All news articles, documents, and Google Earth projects will be made available after the broadcast on my X profile at x.com/WarTrackerTV. And my YouTube will serve as the permanent platform for all previous episodes. All right, so today we're going to talk about some stuff in Ukraine. Not a lot of crazy developments, but we got some firsthand accounts. There's been more nighttime bombings from the Russians, so we're going to talk about that. Gaza, lots and lots going on with Gaza. As we speak right now, there's a big United Nations meeting. Countries from all over the world are kind of putting their 2 cents in, what they think about this situation and the two-state solution in particular, which of course is, creating the state, the country of Palestine. Which does not currently exist. Palestine is not a country right now. It's just considered kind of a region out there. After that, we're going to just briefly touch on Afghanistan and some of the refugee situation that's going on there right now. And then we'll end with Syria. Right now, we got some aid going out to Syria. All right. So we'll start off with Ukraine. In the last 24 hours... Here's our story. Russian missiles hit a Ukrainian army training ground, killing at least 3 soldiers. Russian missiles hit a Ukrainian army training ground, killing 3 soldiers, wounding 18 others, authorities said, targeting Ukraine's efforts to make up a severe manpower shortage in the nearly 3.5-year war. So they're specifically targeting soldiers, trying to reduce the manpower that Ukraine has. That's one of Russia's biggest assets is their massive population, and then compared to Ukraine, they really dwarf them. Let's see, Russia population, 143 million. Ukraine population, 37 million. So yeah, you're talking about 4 or 5 Russians for every Ukrainian. All right. The Russian Defense Ministry asserted that the strike killed or wounded about 200 Ukrainian troops. The ministry said Ukraine's 169th training center near that town in the Chernihiv region was hit with 2 Iskander missiles, one armed with multiple submunitions and another with high explosives. Now let me make this a little bigger for y'all here. There we go. Meanwhile, Russia continued its stepped-up aerial campaign against Ukrainian civilian targets, launching 78 attack drones overnight. This was last night, including up to 8 newly developed jet-powered drones. So they're making new drones, better, faster, stronger, more deadly drones. At least 5 people were wounded in those attacks. More civilians are being killed. Yesterday, I was talking a little bit about the fact that civilians have, for the most part, they had the opportunity to get out of Ukraine before this invasion. If you remember, Russia had kind of staged a bunch of troops on the border for a while. Let's get that bot out of here real quick. Russia had staged troops at the border for a while, so it was pretty obvious what was about to happen. And so a lot of Ukrainians were able to make their way out, which was excellent, obviously. And that's been a big factor in kind of mitigating some of these civilian casualties. But also, it was a lot of people on the eastern side of the country that left. People on the western side, I think, felt a little more secure because of distance from the invading forces. So more civilians are being killed. The UN mission to Ukraine notes a worsening trend in civilian casualties from Russian attacks this year, with 6,754 civilians killed or injured in the first half of this year. So that's a 54% increase from the same period as last year. So we're going to get in. The next article is going to kind of maybe give us a little insight into why more civilians are dying in Ukraine than previously. Since Russia launched an all-out invasion of Ukraine back in February 2022, at least 13,580 Ukrainian civilians, including 716 children, have been killed. And this is according to the United Nations. So 13,000 killed in 3.5-ish years. Now, just in the first half of 2025, there's been about half that many killed or injured. So it does seem to be ticking up recently. U.S. President Donald Trump said Tuesday he's giving Russian President Vladimir Putin a shorter deadline until August 8th now for peace efforts. So that is the day, August 8th. To make progress, or Washington will impose punitive sanctions and tariffs. Western leaders have accused Putin of dragging his feet in his U.S.-led peace efforts in an attempt to capture more Ukrainian land. Attacks on Ukrainian military facilities. Ukrainian forces are mostly hanging on against a grinding summer push by Russia's bigger army, though the Russian Defense Ministry has claimed recent small advances along the 1,000-kilometer front line. Ukrainian ground forces acknowledged the Russian strike on a military training ground in the Chernihiv region of northern Ukraine, but its casualty report differed widely from Moscow's. Russian Defense Ministry video showed multiple small explosions apparently caused by a missile with a shrapnel warhead, followed by one big blast, apparently from the other one armed with the high explosive warhead. Similar Russian strike occurred last September when 2 ballistic missiles blasted a Ukrainian military academy and nearby hospital, killing more than 50 people and wounding another 200. Ukrainian authorities said a commission led by the head of the Military Law Enforcement Service has been formed to determine whether negligence or misconduct by officials contributed to the casualties. Interesting. The attack was the 4th deadly strike in 5 months on Ukrainian military facilities. The previous 3 killed at least 46 soldiers and wounded more than 160. Russia's been trying to disrupt Ukrainian military recruitment by hitting regional buildings coordinating the call-up. On Wednesday, Russian forces targeted a regional military administration building in the northern Sumy region, injuring a 75-year-old woman, the administration said. It said they struck the same building with drones last Friday and Saturday, so multiple times hitting the same building here. Ukraine badly needs more troops. Though Ukraine has more than 1 million people in uniform, according to the National Guard and other units, including the National Guard, it badly needs more. There have been questions about how Kyiv is managing the war, from a flawed mobilization drive to the overstretching and hollowed out of frontline troops through the soldiers going AWOL. Ukrainian President Zelensky signed a bill Tuesday that allows Ukrainian men over the age of 60 to voluntarily sign contracts with the armed forces. Damn. The law allows those who want to contribute their experience and skills, particularly in non-combat or specialized roles. In February, Ukraine's defense ministry began offering new financial and other benefits that it hopes will attract men between the ages of 18 to 24 to military service. Men in that age group are exempt from the country's draft, which covers men between 25 and 60. Okay, interesting. Ukraine has lowered its conscription age from 27 to 25, but that failed to replenish the ranks or replace losses on the battlefield. So, as predicted with this war, manpower has been a huge problem for Ukraine. Russia is just sending waves and waves of people after waves, and Ukraine is just struggling. So, 18 to 24, that age group is exempt from Ukrainian draft. Now, that's crazy because in the United States, at the age of 18, you have to register for the draft if you're male. So it's kind of wild that that age group is excluded in Ukraine, a country that's been at war for the last 3 years. Interesting. All right. So now we're going to read a little bit about Russia's air war. This is from Business Insider. How Russia's air war against Ukraine has changed as seen from NATO surveillance jets. So NATO has been surveilling the air portion of the war for a long time now, pretty much since the beginning, and kind of just observing, keeping track of how the Russians are operating. This probably has a lot of strategic value to observe this stuff for NATO in the event that, this war expands to NATO countries. So these guys are in Polish airspace somewhere. And we'll just bring this up real quick so we can get an idea. So these guys are somewhere over in Polish airspace observing Russian planes flying around. The crew of this NATO surveillance aircraft may not be able to see every detail of the fighting in Ukraine from its cruising altitude of 30,000 feet, but they still have a surprisingly clear picture of the battlefield. From high above Eastern Europe, NATO's airborne surveillance teams operating the alliance's E-3 Sentry planes have tracked Russia's evolving air war since the start of its full-scale invasion of Ukraine. In the early days, air crews watched Russian warplanes fly bombing runs towards the front lines. Now, aircrafts are rarely seen crossing into Ukrainian airspace, having largely been replaced by standoff missile strikes and drone attacks, as both sides rely more on air defenses and long-range firepower. So we were just talking about how there's been an uptick in civilian casualties in Ukraine, and I think this has a lot to do with it. The Russian bombs that they're dropping now are not coming from planes that are flying over the sky in Ukraine. Generally, when you're doing that, you're able to be a lot more accurate with your strikes. Now it's largely been replaced by standoff missile strikes and drone attacks. So we've been hearing more and more and more about Russian drones. Obviously, for a large part of this war, the Ukrainian drones have been a huge part of their defense. But it seems like after a couple of years, the Russians are kind of catching on to that. And now they're starting to employ a lot of drone attacks as well. Just over the weekend, I think it was Saturday night, they had something like 1,000 drones flying over Ukraine, doing attacks and stuff. So obviously trying to manage that and get all of those strikes where they're supposed to be, a lot of times it just doesn't go the way you would think. They're losing a lot of their precision by doing things this way. So I think that probably explains some of the upticks in civilian casualties. At the beginning of the war, you saw a lot of activity. They're talking about air activity from the Russians. But at the front lines, as the front lines gradually froze and the war became more static, there was less activity with airplanes. That's actually what we saw on our side. In the early weeks of the invasion, Russian jets and helicopters were commonly seen in Ukrainian skies, flying deep into the country to support advancing forces, though often inadequately. Losses and effective Ukrainian air defenses, which Russia failed to suppress, have blunted its efforts. So another reason they're doing this is because the Ukrainians have been extremely good at shooting down their helicopters as well as their aircraft. Now, I know there's been trackers, Russian equipment losses in Ukraine. You got to kind of take these numbers with a grain of salt because I do believe they come from the Ukraine Defense Ministry. All right, here we go. So this is as of July 1st. So this is from, visually verified Russian losses in Ukraine from June 1st to July 1st of this year. So there's probably not going to be a lot of planes. Well, actually there are. Okay, I see what we're doing here. So the total number since the start of the war, I think, is in black. And then these kind of yellowish numbers are what happened in this month. So according to this, Russia has lost 162 planes. And they lost 21 of those in the last month, basically in June. And they also lost 157 helicopters, only lost one last month. They're probably not using those anymore. Would explain that, I'd reckon. So, AA guns, self-propelled AA, surface-to-air missiles. Yeah, so really, I mean, they're still losing aircraft. But I also think some of these aircraft they lost might have actually been in Russia during some of those sabotage missions that the Ukrainians were running. Very, very possible that was what was happening there. All right. Let's see. The war moved east, where Russia could lob missiles into Ukraine or let its bombers fire from relative safety. Both sides fielded air defenses so thick that the NATO air crews watching from high above could see their shift. Pilots on both sides stopping flying into range, and Russia's air war became increasingly remote. The skies over Ukraine have become a battlefield defined by denial, not by air dominance. Neither side owns the skies, so Russia and Ukraine punish the enemy from a distance, and the E-3 surveillance crews have seen the difference. NATO's eye in the sky. The E-3, a modified Boeing 707-320 passenger jet, can detect hostile aircraft, ships, and missile launchers from far away. It has a 360-degree rotating radar dome that can see over 300 miles across the air and surface, and high-tech sensors that, unlike ground stations, are not restricted by terrain or the curvature of the Earth. Interesting. All right, so these are the E-3 planes that NATO's flying around, kind of monitoring the skies and the ground over Ukraine. The Airborne Warning and Control System, or AWACS, can also track friendly assets and interface with them. Okay, I know that because I used to talk to these when I was in the military. Data collected by the plane can be easily distributed in real time to NATO aircraft, ships, or command centers, giving allies critical situational awareness during war or peacetime. NATO received its first E-3 in the early 1980s, and the small but capable fleet has flown and supported numerous missions and conflict operations in the decades since, including over North America, Europe, and the Middle East. Russia's illegal annexation of Crimea in 2014 marked a turning point for the AWACS fleet, which began to see increased activity in Eastern Europe. After Moscow's full invasion in 2022, NATO intensified its air patrols to better monitor Russian activities and deter any aggression along the alliance's eastern flank. Major Ben, an American officer and the E-3 fighter's allocator in charge of coordinating with other aircraft, said NATO's air policing missions in Eastern Europe have gone from sporadic to regular since 2022. We fly more and we provide more deterrence. Coming from Major Ben. I assume this is his first name to keep him, this is an American officer, and they're not going into much detail, so he's probably an intel officer. Obviously, this is dealing with intelligence. Surprised that they were even able to get him, get some quotes from an active intel military member, but like other members of the multinational crew that Business Insiders spoke with during the flight, could only be identified by his rank and name for security. Okay, there you go. I need to stop the... it inevitably explains it. The E-3 doesn't carry weapons, but it provides situational awareness, coordination, and visibility that extend the alliance's radar horizon by hundreds of miles and make it harder for an adversary to hide movements or attempt surprise attacks, boosting deterrence. All right, so here are the glide bombs. These are pictures of glide bombs. Okay. Now, I'm not real familiar with the glide bomb. Let's figure out what that is real quick. Glide bomb is a type of air-dropped bomb that uses pop-out wings and guidance systems. There you go. So it's a GPS-guided bomb that can fly to its target. Unlike traditional gravity bombs that fall straight down, glide bombs can glide for extended distances after releasing, allowing them to be deployed from a safer distance from the target and minimizing exposure of the launch aircraft. There you go. These are long-range bombs that can kind of find their way to their targets. AWACS fleet is also tracking how the battlefield has changed in Ukraine. Captain Jasper said air power was a heavy feature at the start, but this slowed down as the war shifted from maneuver-heavy combat to a more attritional campaign, and the front lines became static. So there really hasn't been a lot of change in territory in this fight. lately. What we see is more ISR flights, surveillance, and reconnaissance flights, and not as much air activity into Ukraine anymore. Well, that kind of just drives the point home here. So that is what the Russians are doing now. Here's another article. This is from Al Jazeera. They chase ambulances is the title. Russia's record attacks on Ukraine's healthcare. So this is something that's very important. This falls under the war crime category. So will the international community ever hold Russia responsible for this? And what does that look like? Who knows? But let's see what they're doing. Emergency healthcare workers in war-torn Ukraine say they have been targeted by drones. So look what happened. Emergency doctor Elena Davzenko was far enough from her vehicle when a Russian drone struck it, breaking the windshield and splattering pieces of shrapnel around. It was getting dark on July 9th in the bombed-out, nearly abandoned city of Kupiansk, which sits less than 5 kilometers from the front line of the northeastern Ukraine region of Kharkiv, just 40 miles west of the Russian border. So this is going to be Kharkiv. So somewhere over here is where this woman works, and she's a healthcare worker. She either a first responder or an ambulance driver. I don't think it said exactly what she does. They got to kind of protect the Ukrainians too. Unfortunately, their identities and locations and stuff, occupations. But there was definitely enough light left for the Russian drone operator on the front lines opposite side to see that Dazenko's vehicle was a white ambulance with red stripes parked near a shelling-damaged hospital where she and her colleagues were. Okay, so they got an ambulance parked next to a damaged hospital. It's still light enough out that they think the Russian drone operator can see what their, ambulances have to be prominently marked in order to receive the kind of, wartime protection that the Geneva Conventions is supposed to provide. So, of course, assuming all that is true, basically what they're saying is there was enough light out that this Russian drone operator should have seen and acknowledged that they were about to strike an ambulance. We heard the drone move. It swirled and swirled around the building. Then we heard the blast. So it sounds as if the drone was circling the building looking for a target. Then the operator saw the ambulance and said, yes, let's hit that. She and her colleagues were shocked and angry, but not surprised. They have been hearing regularly about Russian drones targeting ambulances, rescue workers, and the people they were rescuing, mostly the elderly who refused to leave their homes, pets, kitchen gardens, and family graves. So most of the people that have refused to leave Ukraine have been older people. They change ambulances every other day. Oh, they chase, rather. Every other day they're chasing ambulances with drones. They definitely target us. 30-year-old paramedic said. Their job is among the most dangerous professions in wartime Ukraine. Some 200 ambulances have been damaged or destroyed by Russian shelling attacks each year since the full-scale invasion began in 2022, said the World Health Organization. Ambulance workers and other personnel servicing health transport face a risk of injury and death 3 times higher than that of other healthcare service workers. Well, there you have it. Ambulance drivers and workers, so first responders, are dying and being injured 3 times more than their fellow healthcare services workers. So that would be like, nurses and doctors who are working inside hospitals. So the people going out of the hospitals trying to pick people up that are injured and help people out are the ones that are being targeted. Premeditated systemic attacks on ambulances are part of the Kremlin's wider strategy to destroy Ukraine's medical facilities and deprive millions of access to healthcare, exacerbating their stress as well as physical and mental health problems. So this is one of Russia's strategies to beat the Ukrainians into submission, basically. Oh, thanks, Logan. I appreciate your lurk, brother. And good luck fixing that PC. Some 68% of Ukrainians already report a decline in their health compared to the pre-war period, who said, and 46% are concerned about their mental health. That's kind of surprising. After 3 years of war, only 46% of Ukrainians are concerned about their mental health. I think that kind of says more about the culture in Eastern Europe than it says about how they're actually dealing with this war. I think the actual numbers got to be a lot higher than that, but there's a certain element in Eastern Europe of just toughness that I think is kind of instilled in a lot of these people. There's just been, if you look at the history of Kyiv, for example, I mean, that city's been destroyed multiple times over historically. So this is a region of very tough people who are, if they weren't, they would have probably surrendered by now. I think that in and of itself is enough evidence to say that these are some very tough people. So that's probably why that number is a little less than you would expect in terms of people worried about their mental health. I don't think mental health is a trending topic in Ukraine or was before the war, like it is in some of these, Western countries. The WHO did not specify the number of casualties among ambulance workers, but said that since 22, it has verified 1,682 attacks on healthcare facilities and workers in Ukraine that have resulted in 128 deaths and 288 injuries of health professionals and their patients. Okay. Children in line of fire. In an earlier assessment last August, it said the number of attacks was the highest number WHO has ever recorded in any humanitarian emergency globally. Well, that's a big statement. World Health Organization. Let's just see real quick, when was that founded? When was World Health Org founded? So 1948, right after World War II. So basically in 77 years, the World Health Organization has not seen any conflict where that number of attacks have happened on medical people or medical facilities. So this is an unprecedented thing, at least since World War II. These attacks are a deliberate crime against humanity aimed at destroying civilians and those who stand on the front line fighting for their lives. That's a quote from the Ukraine Health Ministry. That was actually a quote from a year ago, in July of 2024. The statement followed last year's July 8th strike that killed 2 hospital workers, wounded 8 children, and injured hundreds, and Ukraine's largest children's hospital in Kyiv. Russia used an X-101 missile that flies low to avoid detection in air defense, maneuvers mid-flight, and hits its target with a 10-meter accuracy even if launched from 3,420 miles away. It's a 5,500-kilometer range missile that flies under detection and can't be destroyed by current air defense capabilities. That is incredible. And they're aiming those missiles at hospitals. So that is Russia for you in a nutshell. Moscow routinely denies responsibility for deliberate attacks on healthcare, claiming it only strikes military sites and personnel. International relief groups say they are aware of the gravity of the situation and are ready to keep supporting Ukraine's healthcare. Unfortunately, these types of situations are not new, but we are resilient and we're going to continue. Goes back to that mental health thing. Tough people, we are resilient. We're going to continue. And that is a quote from the Eastern Europe and Project Hope international humanitarian group who is helping out Ukrainians. The group maintains 13 ambulances in 4 Ukrainian regions, 5 of which are in Kharkiv, and including the one that was struck by a drone in Kupiansk. Other ambulances have also encountered drones in recent months, but the teams were not hurt. That's something you cannot escape. Eventually, you need to be prepared. Luckily, we didn't report casualties that time from our team. So, yeah, this is crazy situation. The Russians, obviously, their word means nothing. I think the world has kind of figured that out by now. But you add into it the deliberate targeting of hospitals and all that. And the thing is, Moscow's saying, oh, we're not doing this on purpose. I'm going to reread this quote. The WHO did not specify the number of casualties among ambulance workers, but said that since 2022, there have been 1,682 verified attacks on healthcare facilities and workers. So the thing is, if it's not deliberate, then they're doing more than one a day. How many days is this? How many days since Russian invasion? How many days has it been? Today marks... Whoa, really? Today is the 1,000th day, actually? Oh, no, this was on November 19th, 2024, which was a little over 6 months ago. So we're somewhere around 1,200 days of this conflict. So 1,200 days of the conflict with 1,682 confirmed attacks on healthcare facilities. That's not an accident. You know, if there were 87 attacks on healthcare facilities and workers in the last 1,200 days, you would say, okay, probably an accident. But they're doing this more than once a day. This is about a 1.5 attack a day rate on healthcare facilities and workers. So pretty much every single day, if not twice a day, or, you know, some days more, some days not at all, but on average about 1.4, 1.5-ish, just doing the math in my head, attacks a day since the start of the war. So to say that this is not deliberate is just a bit silly. You know, it's a bit silly. But this is kind of what you come to expect from Russia. All right. And we got one more article to talk about. I brought up oil purchases, natural gas purchases the other day. How Europe, for a long time, they were still importing a lot of Russian oil. And it has gone down significantly. But it is still a thing. So this is from the Kyiv Independent. Russian oil exports down from last year, Bloomberg reports. So they're reporting on a Bloomberg article. Now, I'm pulling this from the Kyiv Independent because presumably we're going to get a little bit of Ukraine's opinion in this article. Russia crude oil exports declined sharply in the first 7 months of 2025, falling by nearly 30 million barrels compared to the same period in 2024. Let me zoom in here. All right. According to shipping data compiled by Bloomberg, Russia exported 4% less crude oil, roughly 30 million fewer barrels during the same stretch last year. So it's gone down only 4%, but still, that's 4% reduction in oil revenue for Russia. The decline is even steeper compared to 2023, when exports down 7% so far this year compared to that, I'm guessing. Bloomberg analysts noted that shipping data offers critical insight into what Russia actually sells to global markets, particularly as the Kremlin classified oil production data shortly after launching its full-scale invasion of Ukraine in 2022. Export volumes now serve as the clearest indicator of Moscow's crude oil output. Asia, particularly China and India, remains the primary market for Russian oil, with exports to the region steadily at 2.86 million barrels per day. So this is something I didn't know. China buying oil from Russia, no surprise there. India, however, buying lots of oil from Russia, that is a little bit surprising. And the reason why is because India is a pretty strong ally of the United States. You think we maybe would have pressured them into not buying so much oil from the Russians, but also, I mean, for India, it might be their best choice, only choice. I don't know enough about like India's relationship with the Middle East to really make an assessment on that. I know obviously they don't get along with Pakistan, so there's that. But I don't think Pakistan's necessarily the spokesperson of the Middle East, or, you know, what happens to them affects the whole region kind of thing. So maybe that has a role to play in this. Maybe it doesn't. Meanwhile, shipments to Northern Europe, the Mediterranean, and the Black Sea region have fallen significantly since the start of the full-scale war. So this is what's really important: is the Western, the European nations need to stop buying Russian oil while they're funding the Ukrainian fight against Russia. Russia's economy, long reliant on oil and gas revenue, is showing signs of strain amid declining energy income and ongoing Western sanctions, according to both Russia and Western financial analysts. So Russian financial analysts are admitting that these sanctions are starting to drain the economy of Russia. Further economic pressure could come if President Trump falls through on his threat to impose secondary tariffs on countries that continue buying Russian oil. Well, there you have it. So Trump, I was not aware of this, but President Trump has made the threat to impose additional tariffs on top of whatever new negotiations they're making on a country per country basis. If they keep buying oil, though, Trump's saying that the United States is going to put another tariff on that country. Interesting. Trump initially gave President Putin a 50-day deadline to reach a peace agreement with Ukraine in order to avoid new sanctions, and that timeline was recently shortened. We know this a couple days ago, from 10 to 12 days, with Trump citing growing frustration and impatience with the Russian leader. And I think a big part of that has been the fact that they really upped their drone strikes last weekend. Trump puts out this, hey, figure this out in the next 50 days. And then the response from Russia was, all right, well, let's bomb the crap out of Ukraine. So apparently Trump took that and decided his counter was going to be, well, now you only have 10 to 12 days. And so in another article we read, it's going to be August 8th is the deadline for Moscow to figure something out with Ukraine. Now, Ukraine, they've made it pretty clear, at least President Zelensky has, they're not going to give up any territory. They want all their people back. They want Russia to rebuild all the destruction in Ukraine. So they got demands that you would expect to hear from a country that's been invaded, but also, are they realistic? Does anyone think that Russia is actually going to be sending billions of dollars to Ukraine to rebuild it? I highly doubt that's ever going to happen. It sounds good in theory, but unfortunately, I just don't see. There's nothing in the history of Putin-led Russia that leads me to believe they're going to finance the reconstruction of Ukraine should this war actually end in the next 8 days, which it probably will not, but we'll find out August 8th. That is the deadline now, apparently, according to a previous article. And of course, I'll post these articles on my X at the end of the stream. But yeah, that's the day. So we're going to find out August 8th what happens here. Either this war is going to start winding down, or the United States is going to impose further sanctions on Russia. Now, right now, we're only buying about $3 billion, we're exporting about $3 billion worth of primarily like medical equipment and stuff to Russia. And then we're importing about $500 million of random products and stuff from Russia, probably some raw materials, I would guess. Russia does have a lot of resources that aren't quite accessible to within America, so could be part of it. It's a very big country, biggest in the world, so they have a lot of natural resources. But that's all for now for Russia and Ukraine. Obviously, this is a situation that, like I said, in the next 9 days, I think there's 31 days in August or in July. Yep. So we have about next Friday. It's Wednesday today. Next Friday is the deadline. So we will stay tuned, see what the hell happens there. All right. Let's move on to Gaza. Still a lot happening in Gaza. not much of which has been good. I mean, really, not really any of it. So let's dig in here. Dozens of Palestinians killed by Israeli fire in Gaza, officials say, as the hunger crisis grinds on. You know, it's weird because it's like every day I'm reading the same article over and over again. And, you know, you just want something to change for these people. This is sad. I mean, yeah, you just keep seeing these same photos here. People with pots and pans just reaching out over fences, begging, crying. I mean, none of these, you know, what did this kid do to deserve this? I don't think he's part of Hamas. So, you know, that's kind of where we're at with Gaza right now is, are you really punishing the people who were responsible for October 7th at this point? The international community seems to disagree that this is a valid punishment for the Palestinian people. Right now, as we speak, let's see, is this still live? Oh, okay. So this actually ended, but I was watching going into this UN conference on the two-state solution. Basically, it was one country representative after another coming up. They were all kind of more or less saying the same thing about Gaza, which is that they're supporting the two-state solution. I think France kind of led the charge. The UK followed shortly after. And interestingly enough, and this is a part that I kind of want to touch on, Saudi Arabia has been brought up many times when I was listening to that UN conference about their support. And so apparently it was France and Saudi Arabia together who ushered in this gathering of the UN to talk about this two-state solution. And the reason I find that interesting, you know, Saudi Arabia and Iran are mortal enemies, very, very stiff enemies. A lot of people don't know this, but Saudi Arabia, they're Sunni Muslims. They a little bit radical. There's Wahhabi Sunni Muslims who are they embrace Sharia law and stuff like that. It's not necessarily the norm in Saudi Arabia, but also it is kind of widespread. Now that's interesting because Palestine, obviously Hamas is Iran-backed, which means that Iran is Shia Muslims. So Shias, Sunnis, they don't get along. They haven't for the last 1,400 years. But now, in spite of the fact that there is a large influence of Shiite Islam in Palestine, the Sunni Muslims of Saudi Arabia have come to the table to stand up for the Palestinians. And again, that's interesting because once again, the human element, the human element is kind of permeating these preconceived alliances and stuff like that, where this person and that person usually don't agree on something, and yet they agree on this, which is that, you know, this has gone for far too long. Usually you're not going to see Saudi Arabia stand up for Shia Islam or Muslims who practice Shia Islam. I think Saudi Arabia was very quietly cheering on the Israelis when they were attacking Iran in the 12 Days War last month. They want to see Iran eradicated. They really do, because this is a long-term battle that they've had within Islam. But Saudi Arabia obviously has Mecca. That's kind of the, you know, everyone in Islam prays facing Mecca. So Saudi Arabia kind of claims like we are the center of Islam. Iran claims the same thing, but they're two different sects of Islam. So when you talk about sectarian violence and stuff like that, this is what you're talking about. These different branches of Islam, each of which has a reasonably large portion of people who are very radicalized jihadists, very anti-West, and all that, and they exist on both sides. On the Sunni side, you have Al Qaeda, you have ISIS. On the Shia side, you have Hamas, you have Hezbollah, you have the Houthis. So these terrorist organizations exist within these, but they hate each other at the same time. Now, to us Westerners, they're generally indistinguishable, but they don't believe in the same stuff, and generally you see them very against one another. So when you talk about like having unity in the Middle East and stuff like that, and peace in the Middle East, it's going to be very hard to achieve that when these two sects of Islam continue to not get along. And this all goes back to what they believe the succession from the Prophet Muhammad was supposed to be. So this is a 1,400 plus year long dispute that they've been having. Now, that was a little side information, but let's read up on this article. Again, this was dozens of Palestinians killed by Israeli fire. Israeli strikes and gunfire in the Gaza Strip killed at least 46 Palestinians overnight and into Wednesday, most of them among crowds seeking food, health officials said. Israel has continued to carry out daily strikes as its military offensive and blockade. My camera is doing weird things. I don't know what's going on there. It was just flashing at me. Let's see. Israel has continued to carry out daily strikes as its military offensive and blockade has led to the worst-case scenario of famine in the territory of some 2 million Palestinians, according to an international authority on hunger crisis. And we read this article yesterday. This worst-case scenario of famine is happening right now, warns food crisis experts. Ceasefire talks appeared to have stalled again last week, with no end in sight in the nearly 22-month war sparked by Hamas's October 7th attack. The Trump administration's Mideast envoy, Steve Witkoff, is expected in Israel on Thursday. All right, so tomorrow Steve Witkoff will be in Israel, according to a person familiar with his plans who spoke on condition of anonymity because they have not been made public. Well, now it is public. More than 30 people were killed while seeking humanitarian aid, according to hospitals that received the bodies and treated dozens of wounded people. Another 7 Palestinians, including a child, died of malnutrition-related causes, according to the Gaza Health Ministry. Yeah, exactly, Logan. We'll talk about the two-state solution in a moment here. And what exactly does that entail and what would change afterwards? The Israeli military didn't immediately comment on any of the strikes. It says it only targets militants and blames civilian deaths on Hamas because the group's militants operate in densely populated areas. So again, it's the classic human shield defense, essentially. Shifa Hospital in Gaza City said they received 12 people who were killed Tuesday night when Israeli forces opened fire towards crowds awaiting aid trucks coming from the Zikim crossing in northern Gaza. 13 others were killed in strikes in the urban Jabalia refugee camp so there's a refugee camp in an urban setting and strikes happened there. Okay. In the northern city of Khan Yunis, Nasser Hospital said it received the bodies of 16 people who it says were killed Tuesday evening while waiting for aid trucks close to the newly built Morag corridor, which the Israeli military carved out between Khan Yunis and the southernmost city of Rafah. Hospital received another body for a man killed in a strike on a tent in Khan Yunis, it said. Okay. Israel has eased its blockade, but obstacles still remain. Under heavy international pressure, Israel announced a series of measures over the weekend to facilitate the entry of more international aid to Gaza, but aid workers say much more is needed. The Integrated Food Security Phase Classification, or the IPC, the leading world authority on hunger crises, has stopped short of declaring famine in Gaza, but did say yesterday that the situation is dramatically worsened and warned of widespread death without immediate action. We read up a bit on that yesterday. COGAT, the Israeli military body that facilitates the the entry of aid, said that over 220 trucks entered Gaza on Tuesday. Now that's far below the 500 to 600 trucks a day that the UN agencies say are needed, and which entered during a 6-week ceasefire earlier this year. So up until this war, the Palestinians were heavily relying on aid regardless, and I believe it was something around 400 UN trucks a day were delivering aid to the Palestinians prior to this war. Now, they just squeezed in yesterday 220 trucks, which is a lot less than they used to get. And now the UN says to kind of make up for the starvation and everything, they're going to need 500 to 600 trucks a day. That is a huge logistical challenge to pack 500 to 600 trucks a day with food and resources and then drive them into a war-torn country and then distribute those goods evenly amongst the people who are, they are just completely out of control in their suffering. And every time they see a truck, they're swarming it because of how hungry they are. Not only that, if you get aid from the trucks, then you got to take it and walk it back to wherever your refugee camp is, which generally is probably not going to be right next to where the offloading zones for these trucks are, if they even make it to the offloading zones. The United Nations is still struggling to deliver the aid that does enter, with most trucks, like I was just saying, unloaded by crowds in zones controlled by the Israeli military. The alternative aid system run by the Israeli-backed GHF has also been marred by violence. More than 1,000 Palestinians have been killed while seeking aid since May. So this is in, just about 3 months now. 1,000 Palestinians have died just trying to get food, essentially. What's probably happening is they're swarming these trucks. And then the thing about the GHF, the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation, is that they do have armed personnel there, because the goal of the GHF, we were reading yesterday, is to ensure that Hamas does not get any of the resources coming into the country. So the only way you can do that is, of course, by having armed escorts and stuff. So presumably, we don't have videos or many firsthand accounts on these individual events, but you can imagine what's probably happening is these trucks, these locations are getting swarmed. The people protecting them are probably getting spooked. And then, one person fires off a warning shot. The next thing you know, there's 10 people firing off shots. These situations are all chaotic. And that's what happens when people are starving. People lose all restraint. People are not standing in a single file line, calmly waiting for their food. This is well beyond that point in Gaza right now. The Israeli military says it has only fired warning shots at people who approach its forces, and GHF says its armed contractors have only used pepper spray or fired warning shots to prevent deadly crowding. So either the GHF is full of shit, or there's some sort of, Hamas is hurting people trying to get food, and then those bodies are showing up in Palestinian hospitals. When a body shows up in a hospital, it doesn't have a story with it. Like, this was the bullet that killed this person came from a gun from an Israeli military person, or it came from a gun from a Hamas person, So sometimes they do incorrectly attribute the causes of death. And with Hamas being, terrorists, they like to blend into crowds and stuff like that. So it's possible that a portion of these Palestinians who have died seeking aid, it is very possible that some of them weren't killed by Israeli military, some of them weren't killed by GHF armed contractors. But at the same time, when there is 1,000 of them, you would assume at some point some of them are victims of the GHF or Israeli military. Now, again, this all goes back to the fact that no journalists are allowed in Gaza. We don't have any concrete evidence one way or the other to determine what is killing all these people. All we have is stories coming out of Hamas-run hospitals in Palestine. So is all this 100% accurate? We don't know. It's hard to know. What you can assume, though, is that if they're claiming there's 1,000 deaths, then there's definitely some deaths, right? You know, you can't just magically make up numbers when nothing's happening. It doesn't work that way. People are going to call you out on it. Now, when you couple this with the pictures of starving children and the pictures of people with their pots and pans just begging for food, and then you say, yeah, this is also happening, now it's starting to become believable, because you can see just through some photos, the few photos that are leaking out, you can see the suffering that's happening. International airdrops of aid have also resumed, but many of the parcels have landed in areas that Palestinians have been told to evacuate, while others have plunged into the Mediterranean Sea, forcing people to swim out to retrieve drenched bags of flour. I'm sure bread tastes amazing after it's got some salty seawater in it. That's sarcasm. Deaths from malnutrition. A total of 89 children have died of malnutrition since the war in Gaza. Now, this is a number that's probably actually lower than the real count, because has every death that a child has succumbed to from starvation been properly reported to the chain, you know, the authorities and everyone who keeps track of this? Probably not. There's probably some children who have died who, you know, their parents were killed a couple days ago and they were just, there was no one there to take care of them. You know, a lot of different possibilities there. Israel denies there is any starvation in Gaza, rejecting accounts from the contrary from witnesses, UN agencies, and aid groups, and says the focus on hunger undermines ceasefire efforts. Hamas started the war with its attack on southern Israel, blah, blah, blah. All right, we all know what happened on October 7th, for the most part at least. October 7th was one of the most brutal and grotesque things that's happened to humanity in a long time. If you haven't got to look into what happened and you have a very strong stomach, you can do that on your own. I'm not going to talk too much about it. It involves a lot of rapes and executions and just torture, and they filmed all of it too. So you can understand why the Israelis are mad, but also, you know, we have to look at what they're actually doing here on a day-to-day basis and question whether or not it's acceptable. And I think people are starting to get to that point. Here is a 2-minute video on how Gaza got to the brink of starvation. We're going to watch this real quick.
How did Gaza reach the edge of starvation? Aid has been a way of life there for more than 70 years. Before the latest war, 80% of the 2.2 million people who live there already relied on it. 650 lorries a day crossed into Gaza, a mixture of aid and commercial goods. Aid distributed at around 400 locations run by the UN. But since the war, triggered by Hamas's attacks on October the 7th, much of the Gaza Strip has been utterly destroyed. Israel's assault has been relentless. Gaza has descended into chaos, its population desperate for food. Nighttime aid convoys have been overrun, civilians killed and injured. But then, in January, a ceasefire began. Israeli hostages were released, and the UN was able to flood Gaza with aid. But Hamas took control of some of the newly arrived goods. That's not just an Israeli allegation. Our own sources inside Gaza have confirmed it. Israel, still determined to destroy Hamas, broke the ceasefire and cut off all aid once more. 2.5 months later, with extreme hunger taking hold, Israel introduced a new distribution system, the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation, an American organization designed, Israel said, to stop Hamas from stealing aid. GHF says it's provided close to 100 million meals at 4 aid points, mainly in the south. But even getting to the aid is dangerous, with people having to trek along designated routes through militarized areas. The opening hours at the 4 sites are unpredictable and short, often leading to confusion and overcrowding. People have to compete with each other and with armed gangs to secure these precious supplies. Hundreds of people have been killed in the process, most of them by Israeli gunfire. So what now? Some aid is flowing, but convoys are regularly swamped by desperate crowds. The only answer, experts say, is to flood Gaza with aid. After 22 months of war, the shadow of starvation is creeping across the Gaza Strip. Without a ceasefire, its deadly progress will be hard to stop.
All right. So that was a great little background into why they started this whole GHF thing. In January, they were able to negotiate a ceasefire. Some of the Israeli hostages were returned. And that held for a little bit. Aid was flowing in, but then Hamas started taking some of that aid. And the BBC was able to independently verify that that was actually happening. That was not just Israel saying that it was happening. So that's why they shifted from using the United Nations for aid and then going with this new GHF thing with when you got people delivering aid alongside armed contractors and whatnot to try and keep the, maintain the peace or whatever. So that's why they shifted, but this new thing is not working. Obviously, people are starting to starve. So again, things have to change. The plan that they put in place to mitigate Hamas's ability to steal this aid, it has not been working. We're going to read a Al Jazeera article here, or actually just watch a video.
Here, the fight against hunger is a race against time. And for some children...
And this, I Googled real quick. I watched this before I went live, but I Googled this, and this hospital is actually in Gaza City that we're looking at right now.
Even if aid arrives today, it comes too late. At 6 months old, Judy Al-Arur is supposed to weigh at least 6 kilograms. But born into starvation in Gaza, to a mother severely malnourished during pregnancy, her life hangs in a balance at only 2 kilograms. Doctors have been trying to keep her alive, but they fear the effects of chronic hunger may be irreversible.
The next stage of harm, after weight loss and electrolyte imbalance, can lead to permanent brain damage. Even if nutritional supplements and proper food are later introduced to the children, they could already be in an irreparable state, meaning their brain and cognitive function would already have been affected.
Judy's grandmother spares no effort to save her grandchild, but in Gaza, not even her own life is certain. Israel has blocked the entry of baby formula, food, fuel, and medical supplies for months. The military has started allowing aid trucks in, but many of those in need say they have not received basic supplies.
There is nothing to her. She's extremely fragile. And of course, the situation does not allow us to provide her with milk regularly. Look at her. Look at her bones. She's nothing but bones, nothing more.
At least 147 people have died of hunger since Israel launched its war on Gaza. More than half of those dead have been the youngest and most vulnerable.
Once the food is able to enter, if it is able to enter, what is that going to look like, and does the problem end there? The reality is it doesn't. And for me as a clinician, that's usually a very frightening time, is starting to feed somebody who has been malnourished for a long time.
The UN says more than 500 trucks of basic supplies are needed each day to alleviate the starvation that has gripped Gaza. Some countries have begun dropping in aid by air, but the UN and aid groups criticize the move as insufficient and proven deadly in the past.
There you have it. Extremely sad situation. Like some of those kids, when people face chronic hunger and then you can't just like shove a bunch of food down their throat because their body starts functioning differently. And it, I don't know all the medical details of it, but it's a long recovery after you've faced starvation and all that. In spite of all this, there's an Israeli minister hinting at annexing parts of Gaza. So we'll read up on this. Israel could threaten to annex parts of Gaza to increase pressure on the militant group Hamas. An Israeli minister said on Wednesday an idea that would deal a blow to Palestinian hopes of statehood on land Israel now occupies. The comment by Zeev Elkin came a day after Britain said it would recognize a Palestinian state in September unless Israel takes steps to relieve the suffering in Gaza and agrees to a ceasefire. So that's the whole article for that. Yeah, I mean, geez, just look at these pictures of Gaza. Like, they've literally destroyed everything. Every house. Every building is just destroyed. I mean, this is pretty crazy. All right. And finally, last thing on Gaza for today, but we'll talk about here another Al Jazeera article. New poll shows plunging U.S. support for Israel's war on Gaza. And this is in response to a Gallup poll that was recently done. Only 32% of survey respondents said, and this is Americans, only 32% of American survey respondents said they approve of Israel's conduct in Gaza, which is down 10 points from the end of last year. A new poll from the research firm Gallup suggests that only 32% of Americans approve of Israel's military action in Gaza, 10-point drop, as anger over atrocities against Palestinians continue to rise. This survey, it was released yesterday, also shows an enormous partisan divide. I mean, I don't want to get too much into the politics here, but 71% Republicans approve, while only 8% of Democrats approve. Overall, 60% of people say they disapprove of Israel's military action. So losing public support from the Americans. Now, there's an interesting quote in here. Let's see. Where is it? Okay. And just yesterday or the day before, the death toll, at least from the Hamas-run health ministries, is 60,000. It just creeped past the 60,000 mark. So Israel has killed more than 60,000 Palestinians in Gaza, imposing a suffocating siege and flattened most of the enclave, reducing its buildings to rubble. The siege is credited with prompting deadly hunger. The UN on Tuesday said there was mounting evidence of famine and widespread starvation. Nevertheless, the United States Congress also remains staunchly pro-Israel on a bipartisan basis. Earlier this month, the legislative push to block a $1.5 billion missile defense support for Israel failed. So there's 435 people in the House of Representatives. Out of those 435, 428 voted. The push was to block missile defense support for Israel, and that was voted against by 422 out of the 428 members of the House of Representatives who voted. So only just under a third of the American public is supporting this war in Gaza on behalf of the Israelis. And yet nearly 100% of Congress is continuing to vote to send more missile defense and stuff to Israel. What explains this schism? They're talking about voter pride. We're kind of getting into politics now. So anyways, during elections in the United States, unfortunately for the rest of the world, world topics do not dominate our elections. We're more likely going to talk about things like abortion or, whatever domestic issues we have. Generally, that gets talked about over anything else happening in the world. So, Logan asked earlier, realistically, who expects the plans will result in peaceful coexistence in the Middle East? So right now they're talking, the UN's talking about, they're trying to put pressure on Israel to accept a two-state solution to this issue in Palestine. So a little background knowledge on Palestine, you know, that name Palestine, it was basically covered a region that used to be known as Judea. So this area, it was called Judea because this is where the Jews were from. This is the land of the Jews. Jerusalem, very old Jewish city. There are Jewish temples, Jewish burial grounds in Jerusalem that are 3,000 years old. So there's that. And then on top of that, Islam has existed for about 1,500 years, not quite. So, you know, there's historical artifacts and stuff in Jerusalem that predate Islam by 1,500 years. Now, the Romans, of course, occupied a lot of this territory, and they were constantly fighting with the Jews, who they had tried to enslave, and there was a big Jewish slave revolt, and then you had the Sicario Jewish assassins that were trying to, you know, kill Romans and stuff, and then, you know, Romans, they crucified Christ and all this stuff. So this is very much a Jewish land. It has been for a long time. It's kind of why I think after World War II, the world decided to carve this area out and give it to the Jews. One, the people who survived the Holocaust, they couldn't go back home. It wasn't an option for them. You know, you're not going to go back home after you've been sent to a concentration camp. You're not going to go back to the place that sold you out to the Nazis. It was never an option for those people to go back to their homes in Europe, unfortunately. And this was kind of a solution that was forced upon the people who already lived there. It was inevitably, you know, whether you agree with it or not, it was inevitably going to cause problems. Now, in terms of Palestine, I was talking about the Romans and stuff. The Palestine is a Roman name. They changed the name of this land from Judea to Palestine, and that was, you know, another effort of theirs to punish the Jews, to, you know, in their fight against Judaism and all that. With all that being said, ethnically, the people of Palestine and Israel are extremely similar. They all derive from the Canaanite people, ancient Canaanite people from the Bronze Age. So there's a lot of ethnic similarities between these folks, at least historically speaking. Now, of course, a lot of the Jewish people that live in Israel now are not necessarily native to that area. They're a few generations removed from having immigrated oftentimes to Israel. I don't really know what the population of Jews in this area of the world was during World War II and how that changed after the them becoming the state of Israel. But I do know, if we look at this, Jewish total population. So the global Jewish population is estimated to be around 15.7 million people. So that's something to remember. What is the Islam population in the world? 1.9 billion. So I'll get this other screen up here real quick. There's 15.7 million Jews in the entire world, and they don't all live in Israel. The second largest Jewish population, of course, is the United States. And there's Jews outside of the United States and Israel, but not a lot. Now, what is the population of Israel? Less than 10 million. And also remember, not all of those people are Jewish. So when you put some of that stuff into context, you start to realize, like, all right, this was always going to be a problem, probably. You've got a very small minority of people living in a large majority area. This entire area of the world is completely dominated by Islam. This whole area. You got Pakistan, Afghanistan, Iran, Turkey, Iraq, Syria, Jordan, Saudi Arabia. All these countries are Islam. You know, the Islam is the prominent religion. So now you get to today's issue, which is, so what do we do with this land known as Palestine and these people known as Palestinians who don't have a state and who are obviously dealing with some of the worst stuff that anyone's dealing with in the world right now. The United Nations, in their conference today, it was one country representative after another, kind of more or less all saying the same thing. First, they were thanking France and Saudi Arabia for getting these talks together. And then second, they were talking about the ability for self-governance, the ability for people to have self-determination, the meaning of freedom. Those basic things that very much so come directly from the United States Constitution. The question becomes, so you've got the West Bank here, a lot of Palestinians, and then you've got Gaza here, 2 million Palestinians shoved into this tiny area. So the first question is, what does a Palestinian state look like? Is it the country here and then the countries over here too? Because that would be a split country. You don't see that very often. I think right now the only instance in the world is Russia. A lot of people don't know this, but this little area right here between Lithuania and Poland is actually Russia. So you don't see that very often. And then, of course, we have one other country that I'm aware of that has split. I don't know why Google Earth does this thing where it... How do I... Can we just tilt it normally? There we go. Jeez. It's such a weird thing. Okay, reset to north. That's what I want. But also you have the United States with the split country, where we have this land known as Alaska, which is separated by this other country known as Canada. We won't talk about Hawaii. It's just an island. So you don't see this very often where a country has multiple territories split. But it's also not unprecedented. So that in and of itself is not a reason to not have a country of Palestine. The main reason the Israelis have been against this is because they do not want, I'm sorry, my map's not up. They do not want Hamas to have legitimacy on the world stage. And of course, Hamas runs the government of Palestine, which of course is all just kind of something they're doing. Whether or not it's recognized by other countries in the world is kind of, you know, it's yes or no sometimes. When I was watching the United Nations speeches and everything that other countries were saying, repeatedly, a theme that kept coming up from those other countries was, you know, we want a Palestinian state. We want those people to have freedom, self-determination, the right to govern themselves, the right to trade with the world, the right to do this and that. But we also acknowledge the fact that Hamas can have no part in this. And that was repeated over and over by, it didn't matter what country. I probably watched 10 or 15 different countries. Nations in Africa, small islands in the Caribbean, nations from South America, Europe, all over the globe, saying pretty much the same thing. I mean, it was really oddly repetitive what these representatives of these different countries are saying. And it's that basically these people have a right to govern themselves, but also we acknowledge the fact that Hamas can have no part in it. So this whole war on behalf of Israel has been the destruction of Hamas, but we see in their destruction of Hamas, they have completely destroyed Gaza. I mean, if we just look at some of these images, the images that we're allowed to see here, I mean, most of what you're seeing, and I'm just talking now about the buildings and stuff, like everything is destroyed. There's still some buildings standing, but I mean, not much. This is going to require so much effort to undo this. It's truly, truly crazy. So I guess what I'm getting at is, let's just say hypothetically in 2 weeks or 2 months or a year from now or something, we finally do have a state known as Palestine. Like, what does that even look like? Because every image I can find online of Gaza right now is just absolutely terrific. And I'm someone, I went twice to Iraq and once to Afghanistan, so I've seen destroyed places and stuff. But what I see in Gaza is nothing like anything I ever personally saw with my own 2 eyes. This is complete and utter destruction. You know, in Iraq, it was a destroyed building here, a destroyed building there. And oftentimes those are deliberately targeted for specific reasons. But then the rest of the neighborhood would be more or less not destroyed. You know, there's a lot of rubble and trash in the streets, of course. Iraq was not a clean country. But they also, you know, they didn't have garbage guys going around collecting trash for the population when they were occupied by the United States and there was sectarian violence going on and Iran was funneling in fighters against us and, you know, all that stuff was happening. So I guess what I'm getting at is my fear is that all these countries in the UN are saying, yeah, let's make a Palestinian state. Yeah, let's make a Palestinian state. And then they make a Palestinian state and then everybody goes, all right, you got your government. Congratulations. You know, because this, obviously, they have to be completely rebuilt. And just look at these photos. Yep, I'm human. Like, this is insane. This is in Rafah, southern Gaza Strip. Like, look at that. There's nothing left. Like, do you think this guy wakes up tomorrow and someone says, hey, we're officially a country? You think he's going to be jumping for joy when he's got this around him? Now, I'm not saying this as a reason to not give Palestinians a country. I'm just saying that act, at least in the moment, is largely just, it's not a very concrete, tangible act, I guess, to really get people out of this situation. Does establishing a Palestinian state mean that the world's going to be able to take over the flow of aid into Palestine? Maybe. Because right now Israel's dictating that. So, yeah, exactly, Logan. I mean, after our occupations, granted, it wasn't to this extent. I mean, geez, but we occupied Iraq for 8 years and Afghanistan for 20 years, with our fight to defeat Al-Qaeda and this group and that group. Is it all that different? I mean, obviously, the United States never destroyed any cities to this extent. I don't think even Fallujah, which was probably the biggest battle of Iraq, I don't think it even looked like this afterwards. So, but also this is 2.5 years in the making. This has been going on for a while now. So, or 22 months rather. I think, yeah, 22 months. So almost 2 years in the making. But yeah, well, but the thing about the Iraqi death toll too was it's very Iraq war death toll. It's very hard because you have to break down this number because a lot of these civilians that died This Iraq Body Count Project compiles documented civilian deaths based on media reports and other public sources, recorded around 186,000 to 210,000. First, you have to remember Iraq's a much bigger country, but also there is an incredible amount of sectarian violence during the occupation after the fall of Saddam. And every single day we would go out on patrol and we would find dead bodies in the streets because of the sectarian violence. So a lot of these deaths, they were not caused by America. Now, a lot of people anti-U.S. don't want to hear that, but now I'm not going to pretend like the United States didn't kill civilians in Iraq, because they absolutely did. Whether it was intentional, as shown sometimes in like the WikiLeaks, or completely incidental, regardless, a civilian death is still a civilian death. It doesn't count any less because it was an accident. So 2006 study estimated 650,000 deaths. As of June 2006, I mean, that's a huge difference. Iraq Family Health Survey estimated 151,000 violence deaths after June. And after June of 06, I mean, I would say it was about a year and a half after this, the war kind of started slowing down. When I was there in 07, it was still very much going on. But when I came back at the end of 08, it had really slowed down quite a bit. So these numbers, you know, they would be higher if they went all the way to 08, but 2007 ORB survey estimated 1 million excess deaths. But it's very difficult in Iraq to really attribute what death was caused by what, just because of how crazy that situation is, or was rather, with all the different groups and players and fighting in between them, on top of the fact that the United States was there. There are people in Iraq who absolutely hated each other, but they were unified in the fact that they hated the United States. So at times they would work together to fight the United States, but then the next day they would be fighting each other too. Let's see, kind of hypocritical, yeah. Gaza numbers properly calculated and attributed. Of course not. You know, but the difference with Gaza is, I think, Israel's completely locked people from coming in and out. No one's been able to escape. There's been no flow of refugees out of the country. And I keep saying country, but again, this is, you know, Gaza, Israel. It's not Gaza, Palestine. So these people don't even have a country. So there's many comparisons, but there's also many differences at the same time. The Middle Eastern wars, they tend to be like this too, where in some ways it seems easy to compare one to another, but at the same time, you know, if you really look at it, there are going to be many differences. I think with this, I mean, this is kind of what you call unmitigated destruction. I think, you know, I want to say the world was a little more critical of America in the beginning parts of the Iraq war than the world has been critical of Israel up until now in this war. Because I want to say 22 months into the Iraq war, you already had Abu Ghraib and the torture of enemy combatants. And that was a huge scandal that really, really damaged the image of the United States military. And I want to say that was in 2004, towards the beginning of the, let's see, Abu Ghraib dates. Let's see, yeah. Torture and prisoner abuse. Let's just look on Wikipedia real quick. When did this happen? Dates in March 2004. During the time that the military was using it, it had 7,500 prisoners. And again, this Abu Ghraib scandal kind of more or less led to the formation of ISIS. And that's another thing that the Israelis have to understand. is when you do stuff like this, there's going to be blowback. I very much do attribute the formation of ISIS to the military occupation of Iraq, because ISIS was formed. It was derived. It became a thing in the Abu Ghraib prison, amongst these prisoners that were there. So blowback in the Middle East is a very, very serious thing. These people are not going to forget this ever. I've brought this up before, but if you suffered the crime of having been born in Palestine, of course I'm being sarcastic there, but if you were unlucky enough to be born in Palestine right before this happened, or, sometime before this, and then you live through these events, you are never, ever going to forget them. You're never going to forget what the Israelis have done to these cities. You're never going to forget the people you loved and lost, whether they were friends or family or whatever, what have you. You never forget that stuff. And I think what Hamas did on October 7th, after all of this, could pale in comparison to what people might be planning to do against Israel after all this. And the Israelis really need to start thinking. I've brought it up that the United States government had zero foresight when they planned the Iraq invasion and the Afghanistan invasion of what was going to happen, what was going to happen next, what this was going to cost the country, what the long-term costs were going to be in terms of all the veterans and mental health problems, and how many people are on disability now and how much that costs, and all the healthcare. And then, I mean, we haven't even started talking about the damage that we did to the countries, So are the Israeli authorities thinking about their image in the world? It doesn't seem like they are. You see images like this, these pictures, I don't think they're thinking about the future. They're only thinking about today. So, yeah. It is a very crazy situation. All right. I'm going to move on from Gaza here. I've got just a short article on Afghanistan. I touched on this very briefly the other day, but when the United States left Afghanistan in, what was that? August 2021? Did U.S. leave Afghanistan? I think it was August 2021. Yeah, it was the end of August 2021. So it's been almost 4 years now. But when that happened, millions of people left Afghanistan, refugees. They did not want to live under the Taliban. If you don't remember, the United States hadn't even left Afghanistan yet, and the Taliban had already retaken the country. Taliban is criticizing neighboring countries for their mass expulsion of Afghans. So now the Taliban, they have the country under control. They're criticizing their neighbors because now they've sent back 2 million Afghan refugees. So Taliban on Wednesday criticized neighboring countries for the mass expulsion of Afghans as Iran and Pakistan expel foreigners who they say are living there illegally. So both the Pakistanis and the Iranians were the recipients of these exoduses of people. So you see, Iran shares this border with Afghanistan, and then Pakistan shares this border with Afghanistan all the way up here. So most outside of the northern border, pretty much all of Afghan's border is shared with Iran and Pakistan. So you could reasonably assume a lot of people are going to be flowing out. Just looking at this, I would say it's probably like 75% of their border is either Iran or Pakistan. Now, you could assume probably Turkmenistan got some, Uzbekistan, Tajikistan probably got some refugees too. But I don't know if they're really expelling people. So those two countries, Iran and Pakistan, set deadlines and threatened them with arrest or deportation if they did not comply. They denied targeting Afghans who make up significant numbers in both countries. Abdul Rashid, the Taliban government's deputy minister for refugees and repatriation, rebuked host countries for the mass expulsions and described the removal of Afghans as a serious violation of international norms, humanitarian principles, and Islamic values. So they don't want these people back, the Taliban. And they are pointing the finger at their neighboring countries for being not humanitarian. The Taliban, nonetheless. Interesting. The scale and manner in which Afghan refugees have been forced to return to their homeland is something Afghanistan has never before experienced in its history. Nearly 1.8 million Afghans were forcibly returned from Iran in the past 3 months alone. So that's 1.8 just from Iran, 1.8 million. A further 184,500 were sent back from Pakistan, and over 5,000 were deported from Turkey since the beginning of the year. Additionally, nearly 10,000 Afghan prisoners have been repatriated, mostly from Pakistan. The Ministry of Refugees and Repatriation said some 6 million Afghan refugees remain overseas. So 2 million people have come back, but there's still another 6 million have left. So that's 8 million Afghanistan refugees total. And I'm sure that wasn't just people who left after the United States left. Surely some of these people left during the 20-year occupation. And then, of course, before that, there was a civil war. And then before that, there was the Russian occupation of Afghanistan. So, I mean, these people have been dealing with war basically for 40 years straight. So a lot of these 8 million refugees, probably not necessarily super recent. Natural disasters have swelled Afghanistan's refugee population. So there you go. They got more issues. The ministry's director for policy and planning has said some 13,500 families were internally displaced due to droughts, floods, and storms. So even within the country, there's people who are refugees, just losing their own homes due to problems. And I will say, when I was in Afghanistan, they have absolutely some of the craziest weather I've ever seen. It would, like, snap of a finger, it would just be crazy heavy rains, and the ground there doesn't soak up moisture very well, so you get flash floods constantly. And a lot of these, places in Afghanistan don't have formal, real roads. So what ends up happening is they're called wadis. These dried out riverbeds are what Afghans oftentimes use for roads. But unfortunately, of course, those wadis are what get flooded instantly when these storms hit. When combined with prior displacements, the total number of internally displaced families in Afghanistan has now reached nearly 2.5 million. That's internal displaced families. It's a number of families. That's not people, that's families. 2.5 million families. The ministry planned to send delegations to hold meetings with host countries focused on legal support and resolving the challenges faced by Afghan asylum seekers. Our goal is to find sustainable solutions through dialogue and cooperation. Humanitarian agencies have warned that the scale and pace of returning Afghans is overwhelming already fragile support systems. So basically what they're saying is people are already struggling in the country, and now millions of people are being forced to come back. So that's escalating the struggles. And even within the country, there's refugees who didn't even leave Afghanistan. They just can't go back to their homes because it was destroyed in a storm or destroyed by a flood, what have you. So another sad situation in Afghanistan. This is another country, much like Syria, that has just been completely battered with nonstop war, it seems, for decades. Very sad. All right, finally, we'll talk about Syria for a moment here. United Nations is sending aid to Syria. Holy pop-ups. All right. Reuters really wants my dollar. Let's see here. No, it's not. I love how they just block out the article. All right. The United Nations is preparing to send a convoy of humanitarian aid to Syria's southern province of Ceuta, 3 aid officials told Reuters, after days of bloodshed left hundreds dead and displaced an estimated 175,000 people. So obviously, that's a lot of people. They're going to need some help. So aid is on its way. The preparations began after Syria's foreign ministry granted United Nations aid agencies a green light to access Ceuta directly. Okay, so the Syrian government's playing nice with the UN. That's very good. They're giving them direct access to that city and region. Very good, according to the correspondence seen by Reuters, following 3 deliveries of aid to the province. Okay, so they've already got some aid trickling in. Very good, very good. And then this is just another article on the massacre that happened. Another Reuters. Reuters has verified 3 videos in which gunmen wearing military fatigues carried out the execution-style killings of 12 unarmed Druze civilians in southern Syria earlier in the month. So the reason why this is important, these guys were wearing military fatigues. Now, the Bedouins, again, those are nomadic tribes. They started this, or it was a tit-for-tat kidnapping thing between the Druze and the Bedouins. But the Bedouins actually started the massacres, as far as everyone can tell. Seems to be the general conclusion. The Syrian government then sent in military representatives to try and cease the hostilities, but they were later found to actually be participating alongside the Bedouins. Now, you've got people in military fatigues, so I think the assumption is made that these were actually Syrian government officials. They're Syrian government fighters. Now, as far as we can tell, the orders weren't to go in and to help the Bedouins massacre the Druze. It seems like during the process of this happening, they allied themselves with the Bedouins, and then this happened. So now we're seeing these videos where people in military fatigues are executing Druze people from last month. The fighters in military-style uniforms pointed their rifles at 3 unarmed men and ordered them out onto a sunny balcony before barking at them to pause. 1 minute. You want to film them? One of the attackers asked his comrade. The unfolding horror, which was already being filmed by one gunman on his cell phone, was delayed for a few moments to allow a second fighter to start capturing the events. Let's go. Throw yourself over, the gunman yelled at the victims, member of Syria's minority Druze faith. 2 of the attackers shot the men one by one as they clambered over the black railing before their bodies tumbled to the street below. According to the footage circulating on social media, which was reviewed by Reuters. So they did these massacres and then they posted it on social media. So that's just more confirmation of what happened here. Let's see what we got here. Headphones aren't working, so you can't hear me. All right, you're a bot. Thank you. Anyways, that is all I've got for today. I appreciate everyone checking this out. We'll be back tomorrow with more information, more updates on what's going on around the world. Again, this is all, we're just trying to understand these events as they happen, learn more about the people involved, the governments, whatever, what have you, all the players and whatnot. So we'll be back tomorrow. We'll talk more. We'll see what happens over the next 24 hours, and we will be back. So thanks again, and I will see you next time.